1, 2, 3, 4.
Hi, and welcome to the Vininspo podcast with me, Ed Merrison. This is where wine is a travel experience. Join us as we pick up bits and pieces, make new friends, and create memories that make our future interactions with wine, people, and places all the more meaningful and fun. My guest on this week's podcast is Judy Finn of Neudorf Vineyards. Neudorf, the name comes from the German Neu, new, and Dorf, village, is a leading light of the Nelson wine region on New Zealand's South Island. Judy and her widely loved husband Tim, who died in October, founded Neudorf in 1978 when there was but one fledgling estate in the area and the Kiwi wine industry as we know it was barely a twinkle in Mother Nature's eye. Last year, Judy was named a New Zealand Wine Growers Fellow for services to wine marketing, so you'll hear heaps of common sense stuff around that. We also talked about how an atrocious teenager of the swinging 60s turned it around, sausage casings, sewing machines, and a stirring example of previous pioneers, pub gossip prompted by foul-mouthed vineyard tiffs, how a statistical blip caused an off-the-cuff career move, ingenious ways to shave zeros off the cost of cooling your winery, how the admirable Nelson navigated its way to cool climate glory, 2 simple rules for successful relationships, when 3 jobs and 4 mortgages is simply the price of passion, handing over the reins to a rosy future, and a Mark Carney-esque rallying cry to create and celebrate. I asked Judy Finn to begin at the beginning.
Well, I was born in Opunake, which is in southern Taranaki, and my father was a country GP there, and Parihaka, which is the local pa, was part of his domain. And then he decided to go back to university and do ear, nose and throat, and they did ophthalmology at the same time. So he went to Melbourne. We lived there for a couple of years, but I was only a baby and my older brother was about 2. And then we came back to New Plymouth and lived there. And New Plymouth it's kind of been reinvented itself as a kind of a cool place. It's got the Len Lai exhibition there. But when we grew up, it was very provincial. It was very small, but it did have a beautiful mountain, Maunga, Mount Taranaki, and then it used to be called Mount Egmont, but we've changed it back to its real name. But you could surf in the morning and ski in the afternoon. That was the one thing you could say about living in Taranaki. It was a good childhood.
And so you were quite an outdoorsy child?
I was forced to be an outdoorsy child. My brothers all sailed and my father sailed, and I hated Saturday afternoons. If somebody lost a crew, they'd bark at me and make me come and crew for them, and they'd just yell at me for the afternoon. I came home wet, cold, and actually I found I take that. Now, Tim also got a yacht, so it was like, just follow me around. But I had an outdoorsy family. I was a reader, and I still am. Reading is my number one thing. But my family did drink wine.
Oh, did they?
Yeah, which is unusual in the 50s.
Yeah, right. From a relatively informed viewpoint or just as an accompaniment to meals?
Or I'd have to say relatively uninformed. My father's no longer with us, but I'd hate to hear that. But in the 50s, there wasn't a lot of information. And all the wine, the Second World War was a great revolution for New Zealand. People came back from Europe and having served in the war with a taste for wine. But what was grown in New Zealand was not very good. No, it wasn't. And overseas wine that was brought in here often was not great quality either, to be perfectly honest. I think we had a lot of Beaujolais cans on picnics. From memory.
Well, before we get into the wine, I want to go back to the books. What kind of books were you reading? Were you a big fiction reader?
Yep, definitely. I read all John Steinbeck. Our family all read, so the books here. I had a broad church, and I still is now. If I look over here, I've got non-fiction books, fiction books, geography books, biography, whatever it is. When I'm bored, I just pick up whatever's handy and read it.
And so does that mean at school English was your favourite subject? Were there any other subjects that you showed a bit of an aptitude for, any other direction you might have gone in?
I liked history, but from my memory at school, once we got to secondary school, my attitude to subjects was really defined by the ability and the likeableness of the teacher. So I can remember great teachers, which I'd like to write to them now and send them a case of Chardonnay, but I can remember horrible teachers who were just so boring. And French, which I sort of had a natural ear for, I just went put off by this appalling teacher. I think all of us felt like that about him. And I think that was the way education was in the 50s and 60s. You sat there and you were taught to. It wasn't interactive. They didn't try to make it more interesting. It was so you survived by grit.
Okay, and with that background, was it always assumed then that you would go to university, and did you know exactly what you wanted to do?
No, unfortunately, between my very nice upbringing and then going to university, I was an atrocious teenager. And I think a lot of us were in those days. That was the sort of, the wild period. And I did all those wild things. And I was actually sent to university quite early because my brother was at Massey and he could look after me, which of course was false. He didn't have an absolutely idea. But I did recover from those adolescent woes and I turned out to be a reasonable human being. I enrolled for science, which is ridiculous. So I did multi-cell, unicell statistics. It was crazy. And then I discovered English was also available. And then during an exam, I just was so bored. I walked out, and nobody of Rosie's age can believe this. I walked out and just walked into the local paper, and I got a job. They were so desperate for journalists. Anybody who could string a sentence together could get a job. And I loved it, and I had an aptitude for it. I wouldn't say I was great, but I had an aptitude.
Right, so you literally walked out and into a newspaper office, and what did you say?
I said, "Hi, I'm Judy McGibbon, and I've just walked out of a statistics exam, and I was wondering whether you would like a junior reporter on board." And they said, "Well, can you type?" And I said, "Sure," which I couldn't. And what are you studying? And I told, at that stage I was studying English. I changed from science. And they said, "Okay, we'll give you a trial." And it was fun. I loved it. I deeply loved it.
Right. And so how long did you spend in journalism? What were the big topics of the day? What kind of beat did you cover?
Well, when you start as a junior, you don't have big topics to cover. So I had all the little topics. But I quite enjoyed that. But then the next newspaper I went to, when Tim had graduated with a degree in agricultural science and he wanted to do a master's in animal behaviour. So I went to the Waikato Times, and that was fantastic. It was an exciting newspaper owned by a very wealthy man who lived in Fiji, and I was deputy civics reporter there, and we had wonderful journalists there. I mean, it was the sort of newspaper days where if you wanted to order a helicopter, you could. You just had to get the chief reporter to sign off on it. They were fabulous days. Those days have long gone in journalism worldwide, I think. But I was there at that time and I loved it.
Right. Describe a little bit the Waikato. We've actually had PJ Charteris on the show before. 1 foot in Australia, 1 foot in New Zealand, but he grew up in that area. But how was that as a place to report on? Big agricultural farming territory?
Well, I think the biggest thing you'd say about the Waikato is it has a strong Māori population. And Michael King actually covered the Māori Wild, which is what it was called in those days. And he went on to be probably one of New Zealand's most well-known Māori journalist or writer. He wrote 2 very highly regarded books, The History of Māori in New Zealand, etc., etc. So he was working in the same newsroom as I was. And for me, it wasn't a problem because I was brought up in Taranaki, which has a strong Māori population. And moving there wasn't difficult. But of course, now we live in Nelson, which has a very small Māori population. So it's very different. And it's a completely different generational change to Māori issues. In those days, I went to learn te reo with Bob Mahuta. So that would be 1970, I suppose, 1968, maybe 1968. And that was unusual to study. Now, Rosie speaks te reo, not fluently, but enough to get by. And my grandson, Freddie, they are bilingual in numbers and nouns at 4.
Oh, fantastic. Well, that must give you a really good perspective on both the issues and identity of the time, but also what's going on at the moment, where there's certainly a perception in Australia that New Zealand is further along its path in coming to terms with, in a useful way, its history and how that feeds into current identity. Is that something that you think New Zealand is travelling a good path on at the moment? I
do. And I'm no expert on this, so this is a purely personal view. The difference between Australia and New Zealand largely is we have a tremendous number of biracial marriages. It's very common. I mean, there'll be very few family trees that wouldn't have somebody that is married. So it's a lot easier to integrate because there's a lot of understanding. And we have, as a Pākehā New Zealander, I've absorbed a lot more Māoritanga than even I am aware of. And it's not until somebody notices it that you realize that it is part of the New Zealand culture. Doesn't stand alongside. We have absorbed it. I think that the way that we react as a family or whānau is we absorb that from our Māori friends, our casualness when it comes to food and our agriculture, and it's part of us.
Well, that's really nicely articulated. We like areas of brightness and optimism, so that's great to hear. But also, you mentioned marriages just now. Tell us a little bit about how you and Tim met, under what circumstances, and what those first impressions were.
I met Tim at university, and he was older than me. And I think when I first came to university, so I knew him at university, but then after he graduated, I sort of re-knew him again. And we've been married since 1972, so I think it's 53 years. And he died last year. A great loss to me and the family, and to Neudorf Vineyards. He was a visionary, and I have utmost respect for what he did. And if I can give you a vision of who Tim was and what he was, Todd told this. Todd is our winemaker and general manager. He told this wonderful story at Tim's celebration last October. He said he needed more cooling in the red winery, so he put a proposition to Tim that had a few zeros at the end of it. And Tim said in his quiet way, well, look, just leave it with me and I'll see what I can do. And he came back about a week later with an old Ford Cortina radiator and a whole lot of bits and pieces. And he made a coolant, which we still use in the red winery today, for under $200. And that is Tim to a T.
How fantastic. Well, you mentioned him going on to do his master's. What was it, in animal behaviour?
Yeah, he did a master's in animal behaviour, which is completely useless to be a winemaker. But that was next door to the newly established Rurakura Agricultural Research Station. And there was a wonderful German there called Rainer Eschenbruck, who was very generous. And Tim got interested in wine at that stage because he was in the animal behaviour unit, which was next door to it. And we started making wine in the washing machine of our flat. And then at the end of it, we had to decide whether we were going to be grown-ups, which we were reluctant to do. And I was sent on a weekend course for future leaders in broadcasting. And I walked out and I said, well, what are we going to do? Because it ain't going to be that. So it was a good thing. I loved being picked, but I was not going to waste my time doing that. So we decided, what would we do? And we came down, and Tim had already developed a love of wine and a love of the knowledge of wine. And it was such an enchanting time that we used to have picnics with all the winemakers. They'd come down from Auckland and Wellington and Christchurch and come to the Abel Tasman National Park, and we'd have a picnic on the beach. There's only about 12 of us. But we were so collaborative, and they're all the very best friends today. And I think that was sort of the start of the family of 12, which we'll probably talk about later. And Tim was a natural scientist and a researcher, and brave. And so we had absolutely no money. He'd just come off being an older student, but we did it, and we came out here and we found this piece of land. It was interesting because Tim was helping another friend build a yacht. No, it wasn't. It was a boat. It was a boat, a big concrete boat. Steel boat, and they were going to travel around the world, and it was nearly getting to the end of that, and this piece of land came up, and we came out to look for it, and there had been a commune called Famagusta, and it was north-facing clay soils with lovely gravel through them. And Tim said, we're going to stay, we're not going to go around the world, we're going to stay here and plant grapes. And I obliged. I didn't really know what I was taking on, to be perfectly honest, but we were so enthusiastic, and when you're young, you have such self-belief. And I think I say that in the website, the self-belief, which was completely unwarranted. And so we did it. We came back here and we planted grapes. And the house had been used as a hay barn, and we lived in it. We had a long drop, which I often say actually was more a short drop. It had been there about 120 years. And we had electricity in 2 rooms and an old wooden stove that didn't work. And it was my parents, who are from Scottish blood and pride themselves on being quite stoical. I think they had tears in their eyes. But we were young, and it was fine. And we still live in that house now. We've tarted it up a bit, but we still live there.
Okay, and what was the land used for before you moved onto it?
Yeah, the area that we live in it's sort of ridges and hollows, and a lot of the land was settled by Germans in 1842. So that's the name Neudorf comes from, that German background. And the only church in the village is Lutheran church. So it was perfect for those settlers because they wanted European mixed farming. So when we arrived here, there was a small piggery and a small 2-cow dairy shed, and there was chooks, and they had a little bit of tobacco, a little bit of hops, a little bit of berries, and that was very normal for the German settlers, who was stoical. They were extraordinary, and we were in awe of it was some of them still, the remnants were still here when we arrived. I remember one up the road, Ferg Avis. He still walked around with wooden clogs with straw in them every day, and they were just that sort of influence. We owe a lot to those early settlers. So the area was never suitable for a big tract of one vineyard. So it might be in Marlborough, which they had sheep farms, which you could change over and those sort of things. But this never was. It was always going to be just baby places. So where we live on Neudorf Road, I look over hops, and I've got boysenberries, I've got apples, we've got a cider place across the road, we've got a little dairy farm that makes great cheese just up the road, and a lot of berries. It's that very mixed cropping. We've got a little group called the Mootry Artisans, and we've got olive oil and sausage making and all those sort of things, just like the 60s. And yet it's 2026.
Yeah, well, I wonder whether as well the fact that you were pioneers in 1978, but you were following in the footsteps of pioneers, the remnants, as you say, of what they did was right in front of your eyes as well. So maybe it made it feel a little bit less odd that you were starting out with nothing and making it all up on your own and having to deal with not exactly the mod cons that you might expect these days.
I think you're absolutely right. I think that was in the ether. And I remember the family that lived here, she was making casing for the sausages on her Singer sewing machine with a treadle. And she said it's wonderful because the pork casings oil the machine. And I thought, there's nothing I could say to compete with that. Sewing my own casings on a machine. No.
Yeah. Were they good sausages?
They were delicious.
I bet they were.
Absolutely.
So what did you plant in the first run of plantings? I'm
going to be honest. We planted Muller Turgau, which we call Mullataga. We only made one vintage of it. It was the wine industry said, you've got to put it in. This is the new grape. It's going on. It was dreadful grape. But we planted what we like to drink. So there was Chardonnay and Pinot and Riesling. That was where we went. We planted Gewürztraminer and took it out, which was possibly a mistake because in those days it was sweet. It was only made as a sweet wine. But since then we've had, obviously delicious dry Gewürztraminer. But to be honest, it was an absolute prick in the vineyard. It ties itself around the knots, and it's low cropping, and it's hard to pick, and it's hard to prune. And I was working in the vineyard, very much those days. I don't do now. So that was the first to go. I said, that's got to go. It's just too much work. And I didn't really like the end result anyway. But our instincts were right with Chardonnay and Pinot. I mean, that's what we're well known for now. Riesling we still love, but the rest of the world doesn't. I don't know what it's like in Australia, but Riesling is, I always think one of the ways to describe it is people come and taste wine, they say, oh, I like that Chardonnay, I'll have a case of that. I love that Riesling, I'll have a bottle of that. It's one of those, selling a case of Riesling, we'd probably ring the bell like they do in Japanese restaurants in the wine cellar. Why is that?
I don't know. It's a perennial frustration that it's not bigger, but it's not a hard sell in Australia. We've got a lot of avid fans, and me being almost first among them. But we do certainly have a situation, I think, where people within the wine industry, winemakers and sommeliers and people who are a little bit more entrenched are absolute diehard fans and somehow incapable of persuading other people to love it as much as we do. So that persists, but it's more popular. It's definitely not a hard sell. Yes,
that's right. We must try and export some to you guys.
If you could just give us a picture of what the New Zealand wine industry was in 1978, from very small, from Nelson even panning out to the whole of the country, what was New Zealand wine growing in 1978?
Well, the bank wouldn't give us a loan. The bank said there's no money in grapes. 50 years later, he may be true. I don't know. We've come a full circle. They said, no, why sheep? Why don't you do sheep? There's money in that. So that was very reluctant. But I think that it was tough, but it was enjoyable. You couldn't get a grafting machine, and I can remember going to sleep with rootstock, and we grafted these, and we turned the downstairs loo into a hot box and sealed it up, and we grafted our own grapes onto phylloxera, which is a resistant rootstock. And we couldn't get a small tractor to go through the rows that we wanted to plant, so we had to use a big Massey Ferguson. So that you can see the old plantings are that far apart, and the new plantings are a bit closer. The knowledge was shared. we spent a lot of time travelling from Upper Motory to Canterbury to Lincoln University there, which is about a 5.5 hour trip. And we'd go there for a tasting at 9 o'clock in the morning. And so we'd be leaving home at, 3 or 4 o'clock and drive and do a tasting. But there was a sense of adventure and conviviality and cooperation, which was wonderful. And I can remember going to these tastings and people were asked to bring their mistakes. And imagine these days, all the winemakers sitting on there saying, well, this was a disaster and this is why I think it was. There was a sense of huge amount of learning going on, which I put down to the background, which you probably have in Australia as well, of agricultural focus groups. So a group of dairy farmers get together and talk, or a group of sheep farmers get to talk and things like that. So that was established as a part of the culture of agriculture in New Zealand, I think. And then when wine came along, you just stepped and you did those things. You shared your problems and said, well, I did this, and quite frankly, it was a disaster. So you're learning at a much faster rate. You're not making all your own mistakes. You're listening from somebody else's mistakes as well. They were heady days and they were a huge amount of fun, and everybody had a lot of energy. So we came and we planted the grapes. I was very involved in making sure that everything was gender neutral, and no way. So I did half the practical work and half the planting. Tim dug more holes. But nowadays we use GPS. And I was telling Rosie the other day, we'd plant these grapes and it would be like Tim saying left, 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 no, stop. And he'd be down one end. And they would always, these rows were imperfect, but I loved them for that. Now GPS, straight on down, done in a quarter of the time. And nobody yelling at you from the other end of the row. I just might tell a story here, which is, we dry farm because we've got soil that's got some gravel in it, so it retains a bit of moisture, so it doesn't go gluggy. But the first 2 years we water, and we had a big old Massey Ferguson with an armchair tied on the back with rope, and I sat there with 2 watering jets like that, and he'd stop, and I'd water the plants, going down and up and down and up and up, and it was quite boring. And get to the end of the row, and Tim swaying around, and I fell off. And I said, don't take those corners so fast. He said, no, but you sort of you lose yourself. So the third time he went round a corner and I fell off, I said, I think you can insert the swear word that you want at that point. You can water your own grapes. I'm off. And it was about 6 o'clock in the morning. We live in the bottom end of a valley, and every neighbour going right up the valley heard me yell. And next time we went to the pub, somebody sidled up to Tim and said, bit of trouble with the wife this morning? And Tim had no idea what they're talking. No, we didn't think anyone could hear. It was held against us for many years, and everybody thought I was a total bitch.
Well, what's interesting, you were heard, you must have been pretty loud, because just to put that into perspective, there was, I think, just one producer there in Nelson before you.
He wasn't very much ahead of us, so it was only, 3 or 4 years.
Yeah, and I think even to this day, if you asked a lot of people around the world to name a producer in Nelson, they would probably be able to say Neudorf, and the list might end there still. But back in, again, those days, late 70s, people might forget that was Nelson, and Marlborough, which we all take for granted as being a juggernaut in the 2000s, but not really off the ground there. Where was the epicenter of knowledge and activity when you started? What were the reference points that you could look to in New Zealand?
That's a really interesting question. I think that we'd probably say Hawke's Bay, because that had a long history from the church in Hawke's Bay. Mission Estate had been there for a long time. Tomato Estate had been planted earlier too. So, but Martinborough was only just happening. Christchurch was just happening. In Marlborough, there were a couple of people, but about the same time, a little bit earlier than us, but none of the big wineries were there. And Central Otago hadn't been heard of as a destination. And I was one of those people that said, Central Otago, that's, life on the edge. But of course, it's hugely successful now, and that just shows how little I know. But it's very hard to look at a new area and think, oh, that's going to be... And they do have a very small window. It's quite scary for them. There's a very small window when if the summer finishes early and the winter starts early, you've lost an awful lot of growing time there. Nelson deserves to be better known. We have lovely warm days. It's usually the sunniest place in New Zealand, but that goes up from, I'm not going to argue about climate. I can't bear people that discuss it, but it's often the sunniest place. Sharing it, say, with Hawke's Bay, and actually this year it was Taranaki, which that's got to be and that's an outlier. Everything was new. Auckland was older. Some of the older Dalmatian vineyards were in Auckland, but they were with hybrid grapes. It was a new series of people making with new viticulture. So that was new viticulture, new winemaking.
It's quite understandable that you might look at the jagged, barren desert of Central Otago and not think it was the ideal place to go and plant anything. But Nelson itself then, what would those natural advantages be as a grape growing region? And just give us the lie of the land if you could.
Well, we like it because it's got warm summers but never hot, so we don't blow out flavours. But we've also got cool evenings. Even in the middle of summer, if we're having a barbecue outside, we'll put a couple of bricks in the fire. It's quite cool at night, and we like that. It gives us a complexity of flavour. It's a genteel place, and the climate is quite genteel as well. It's a lovely place to live, and not that that's justifying its history as a grape growing area, but we're not alone as good winemakers in this region. And this Gren offers fantastic wines. Seifried, absolutely. They're the godfathers of the region, and Hermann is incredibly generous. He spoke well at Tim's celebration. He said that Tim came down with agricultural knowledge and got the north-facing land, and he had always bought the south-facing, which is not true. He was just being humble. But he's very generous guy, and he was lovely to us.
And you mentioned the bank manager not being too keen to lend you money to plant grapes, but I believe that you had something like 4 mortgages and 3 jobs each in the early days to keep things going.
We did.
Just describe those years of, doing it all yourselves, and when things started to feel like they were coming together. What was the learning curve like for you guys?
We were very fortunate. In those days, we entered competitions. We haven't done that since 1983, I don't think. But in 1981, we won a gold medal as our first wine. And that was just sheer fluke. I didn't think the wine was actually that good, to be honest, but it was noticed. So we got kudos for that. I think the biggest thing when I talked to young people coming and asking about it for me was we had it so easy. It wasn't hard for people were chasing us to have our wine, to be our agent. Well, these days, you have to push somebody off a list to get a place in an overseas agency. So there was a real interest in New Zealand wine. New Zealand was hot for a period there. So it was very easy to sell wine, not just within New Zealand, but also out of New Zealand as well. And one of the things that people can't believe, we were paying 24% interest at the Development Finance Corporation, which you work very hard to get rid of your loans when you're paying that sort of money. And we had no money to start with. So I used to write for a couple of papers. I had a full-time job in the newsroom, and I did a few stints as a weekend DJ, and I just did whatever I could. And Tim set up the mobile mutery timber treatment plant with a friend who had a mobile sawmill, and we grew sweet corn and sold it at the market. We did whatever we had to make it happen.
You mentioned you were an atrocious teenager. Was that music and parties? Was music a big part of your upbringing in those days?
I think music is probably the more socially acceptable thing I'll say yes to. It was the early 60s.
Yeah, well, you mentioned being a DJ, but was that a music show that you had?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Music is here, absolutely. I find these days I listen to music more because I find the news of the world. As an ex-journalist, I've always been a news addict, but I find for mental health, I just put old tracks on and listen to music more and more. I just can't believe that I'm looking down the barrel of World War III or something equally terrible. And it doesn't even seem like I'm overreacting saying that, does it?
No. Well, I'll say just for context that we're having this conversation during the week of Davos, where truly some of the strangest and most troubling things I think I've heard ever in the news has just reached a new low in the last week. So I understand where you're coming from with that.
Yeah. But we're all in love with Mark Carney. We all want him to be our Prime Minister. Isn't he a star?
What a fantastic speech. Yes. And let's hope that other people are going to take that sign out of the window. Let's talk about the Neudorf range now. Like, it's obviously gone through a few changes. You've mentioned the early days, the Riesling days, but the Chardonnay Pinot Noir focus. Run us through, if you will, the vineyard sites and the range, and also the style, the approach that you've taken and where that's heading. Okay,
so the overarching thing is for all of the Mutery and Rosie's Block wines, Mutery, Rosie's Block and Tom's Block are all BioGrow certified. And So we take that as a leading style and what we do. So we're very non-interventionist. It's all natural yeast. I always have got to put that sort of subtext in there to say it is natural yeast, but we don't know where the original yeasts came from. But we do have a yeast, Sacramentized Neudorfi, named after us, but any winery that's been around as long as us would have that anyway. But we just luckily enough had someone doing a PhD study and found it. So all natural yeast, solar-powered winery. We've got 3 electric cars. We've got an electric forklift. We don't use a lot of new oak, and the style is always for longevity. We prefer minerality over fruit. We're not fruit-driven winery, but I'd have to say that the variety that you notice is different most is Chardonnay, because there's still, somebody comes in with a Panama hat on, I think they're going to want a big fruity oaky Chardonnay. That's a terrible thing to say because it's possibly not even true 50% of the time, but I sort of clock it. And when I used to work down there, there's a bit of a relation there, a bit of a correlation there between Panama hats and those sort of wines. And that's absolutely valid. I mean, those wines are valid. They can make beautiful wines, but you've got those 2 big schools of thought and you can't change one to the other. So I just say, as long as you're drinking Chardonnay, that's up to you how you want to have it. Pinot Noir, we make a slightly more savoury Pinot, or our site makes a slightly more savoury Pinot. And there has been in New Zealand a preference for more cherry fruits, which we don't produce. And that became normalised, I think, as the way Pinot Noir smells or tastes like in New Zealand. So it's a bit of a battle for us savoury people to be heard, whereas that style sells very well in the world market. But I think this is not a problem that's just New Zealand. Once they've established this is what it should taste like, it's very hard to say to someone there's other ways of doing it. So very low. We often use 4 or 5-year-old oak. We use maybe 10% new oak each year.
Yes, I mean, we wouldn't, to be blunt, we wouldn't be having this conversation necessarily if it weren't for the fact that I fell in love with your Chardonnay first quite a long time ago. And you mentioned the sunshine and the sunlight. I mean, the flavour's never been a problem, but it's always been balanced with sort of flintiness to the Chardonnay and,
Yes.
Great energy. And I see that in all the wines. I haven't had that many aged examples, but enough to both sense in the young wines and to have seen in a few of the more mature examples that they age extremely gracefully as well, keeping that identity very, very well.
We did a tasting of 25 years of Chardonnay the other couple of years ago, and it was really interesting to see that the older vines were just, you wouldn't have picked them as 25 years. So I think that's the acidity that we treasure and love, and I think that's our cool nights coming into play. I have to be honest here, I haven't been involved in making wine for probably 10 years, so my attitude may be off-piste. If Rosie was here, she'd probably be growling at me.
Well, I was listening to an interview that Rosie gave to the lovely Stephen Wong, MW, recently, and so I have heard a fair bit of Rosie's opinions. We'll talk a bit about Rosie a bit later, but I want to just look at where you have been more visible, I suppose, in the shaping of Neudorf, and that is perhaps harnessing that journalistic background in the marketing side of things. You were named 2025 New Zealand Wine Growers Fellow for services to wine marketing, and this is something that I feel that the wine industry is generally very poor at. And generally speaking, I think perhaps where wine is explicitly marketed, it's often quite dreadfully done as well. So tell me how you view that idea of marketing, because for me, it's much more communicating an identity and a sense of openness and honesty and truth, which is probably more of a journalistic thing than an actual marketing thing. So tell me what it means to you and how you think you've managed to be viewed as successful in that.
I think I'm just real. I'm me. That's what I've always thought about. You just be yourself, and that's the best thing you can do, and be true to yourself. And unless you've got a problem which you need to cover up, then I wouldn't. I mean, if I was Donald Trump, I wouldn't suggest that he marketed himself as he does. But I came to marketing because Tim was making wine, and so he said, "Well, you have to sell it." So, and I didn't really know what I was doing. And there is mystery about marketing. There was no degree in marketing when I was around. I mean, I probably would have loved to have done one, but I didn't. It wasn't available. But I think that it's not as hard as it's made out to be. But if you have a sense of, just a sense of people and be able to relate to people and understand people and be warm and empathetic and understand what they want and understand what you want, I think the worst thing, now somebody said this, and I should give credit to them, the elitism that is often apparent in winemaking didn't come from the French. That purely came from the English and their Red Trouser Brigade. And they brought that in, selling French wine before they made it. I mean, I don't know how the English got so arrogant about wine until 10 years ago. They never made any, but they still had established themselves as the world arbiter of what is great wine and not. Whereas the French are much more democratic about it. We've been very lucky with our agents in the UK.
Well, that's right. I suppose the French traditionally have not really bothered a lot of them to market it.
Can I just interrupt you there?
Yeah, go on.
we had a lovely Burgundian intern here, and then we went back and worked with his family the next year. And his mother said to me, David says that you're very good at marketing. We need some help. What should we do? And I said, well, you could put up a sign saying what hours you're open. And they said, oh. And I said, and then if you do close for lunch, I don't think your grandmother should open the door and say, Vonte. Tell them to go. They just had no basic idea. And the idea of advertising a time that you're going to be open and welcome them was just, they did have people that came in and bought caseloads of wine because that was the way it was sold in Burgundy where we were there, that they went round and they'd buy the year's supply. So I was very envious of their sales, but their marketing skills were very poor. But David is now doing extremely well.
I mean, what you just said about putting opening times there probably just goes to something that I've heard you say before when you described marketing as common sense with a bit of flair. And that's, again, quite simple, but an effective truism, I would say.
Yeah. It's also, I think these days, if I just digress a little bit, these days I feel so much for there's a generation coming through that are spending time on their screens. And I think that wineries and restaurants and social groups are going to have a more and more effect on people's basically social skills and happiness because so many of Rosie's friends are isolated from the sort of things that we did. We had a job and you went to the pub afterwards and, that's all gone. I feel quite strongly that we're selling to people and we want people to feel comfortable. And I don't try and sell wine as a health benefit. But I just say that it's actually made for enjoyment. And I think it has a strong role to play for that. And I'm not apologetic about that, despite this current worldwide trend, not talking about the abuse of alcohol, but talking about prohibiting alcohol, that alcohol should be treated with respect. But it's a very strong social, I don't know where it started from. I'm quite interested to see this, or whether in the middle of an arc or whether we're at the end of an arc, I don't know. But it's a real thing.
Oh, yes. I think it's a fairly complex set of forces. Some of those are very, very genuinely anti and also very actively seeking to harness everything they possibly can to put those entirely emphatically alarmist views out there with all sorts of agendas. So it's definitely happening. But as you say, you've seen it as being part of a life well lived and something that has a social purpose, just having wine as part of life, and it's obviously given you some great friendships as well.
It is. It is. It's a social enabler. Let's be honest about it.
Well, one thing, just while we speak about marketing, it talks about how things have shifted, I suppose, from the early days. And I love your point on empathy, because I do think that a lot of the time, the people who are giving out the message or trying to talk about the wine that they might be producing don't really think about the person at the other side of that transaction and what they may want, or rather what this could mean for them. I think that's a big point, really, in empathy. But at the same time, in the current media that we have, it's tricky because there is so much saturation within the channels of the internet. And standing out and being distinguishable is such an important thing. And it's a market, much more flooded now than it was when there were just two wineries in Nelson. So what does it mean to you, that illogicality of marketing, the fact that you somehow have to find the peculiarity of your story to get to people? How do you do that, or how has Neudorf done that?
Probably we've been here. We've done, 53 vintages or something like that, probably longevity, probably being there. We're both reasonably active in our community and we're both active in the politics of wine in New Zealand. And I am a believer in cooperative marketing. And I'm sorry to say that I was quite proud of being brought up in the times of producer boards, which I'm sure you had in Australia as well. So you had the dairy board, the apple and pear board, and all of those sort of things. And those sort of where people worked together so that the marketing was done by that board, and then you came in and topped up with your own marketing underneath that. So we always sold New Zealand first, South Island, Neudorf second, third. You can't go and say, I'm going to make Neudorf famous. We call it Neudorf, by the way, even though the Germans pronounce it Neudorf. But we just simplified it because the New Zealanders are not happy. It's not part that flows off the tongue. So it's Neudorf. But we sell New Zealand first before we sell us. We're a long way down the track. We're too small to be able to have, we don't have the money to support that. But Rosie is very active on social media. And we have been involved in, say, Pinot Noir conferences. And I was part of the inaugural group of the Family of 12, which were 12 small family wineries. Well, not all small, actually, because we had George Fistonich with Villa Maria, he was our daddy. He was wonderful. And then that was starting from Felton Road, Pegasus Bay, Neudorf, from Atarangi, Kumeu River, Craggy Range, Milton, Palliser as well. Milton's gone, which is a great tragedy. Great pioneers in organic viticulture. We set that up to sell the message that we're not Sauvignon Blanc. That was basically it, even though it wasn't politically correct to say that. We were selling Chardonnay and Pinot Noir as a group. We also felt that to protect the planet, there's no point in 12 wineries travelling. So I would do 3 wineries. So say I might be pouring Atarangi, Felton Road and myself. And so there'd be 3 people at a table doing 12 wines. And it was extraordinary in America. They would say, how does this work? And I said, well, to limit travelling, we pour each other's wines. And I can talk about other people's wines much more easily than I can talk about my own. We spent so much time explaining the concept of cooperative marketing. And it was fascinating because it seems to have come quite naturally. I think in Australia, you've got a family of 12 now as well, haven't you?
We have, yeah.
Which came from the one that we did. So that was... We've been involved at that level in international marketing. We've got good agents. We try not to travel too much. We are very aware of the effect on the planet. We do things that are fun. We have a concert once a year here. We have Fat Freddy's Drop. We've had them 4 or 5 times. We have 2,000 people in front of our house, and it's just great. Those things are just sort of saying it's also fun. It's not all serious and stuff like that. Yeah, we're open-minded to anything, I think, but we're not braggers.
No. Well, you've just mentioned so many different things. I mean, you said earlier in the conversation that, you were just true. You were yourself. And I think that's probably almost number one on the list when it comes to having people understand your identity is just to be yourself. But also the longevity. I mean, lots of people would say, oh, well, how are we supposed to have that because we weren't founded in 1978? But at the same time, there's something about being consistently yourself, no matter what that time frame is. People understand you over a period of time when you have the same values and they understand what those values are. Being a community member, being helpful, that's never going to go amiss. And believe it or not, wine and fun is quite an attractive thing for people to see and want to be part of. So, again, I think there's a bit of common sense with a bit of flair that we can see coming through there. You mentioned having good agents. One of my favourite things that I've heard from you before was how you expressed the key, as far as you can see, to having good relationships, which was, and I quote, "Don't be a twat and make good wine."
Life should be so easy. So yeah, but I do say that, and I do believe it. The other thing is, I believe don't employ any agent you wouldn't be happy to have at your family dinner table, because if they're a twat, it won't work out. I have had very few mistakes following that path.
Yeah, very good. Well, I'll just refer back to a couple of messages that really nicely overlap with that. One was, well, I suppose my mentor really at Cellar Hand, where I also work, Patrick Walsh, said exactly the same thing from a distribution point of view, having producers in the portfolio that you would absolutely welcome with warm, open arms to your house to have a drink and cook a meal for in the evenings was one of the most important things. And also Max Allen, who had a sort of similar mantra about how to behave in life, which was don't be a dickhead, was number one. And number two, pay attention, which I rather like. It certainly goes for both people on the production side, but also if you're drinking wine or getting into any element of the culture. I think paying attention is number one to what's going around you. We'd be in a lot less trouble if more people paid attention sooner. Let's move on a little bit then to these days. As I said, I've listened to a fair bit of Rosie. I haven't met Rosie, but she sounds like she is bringing a whole heap of great energy to this next chapter of Neudorf. Todd Stevens, I believe, has been making wine for around 12 years, I think we said.
12 or 13 years, yeah. He's a lovely, lovely addition to the team. He is Tim. The two of them were just so happy in each other's company. He's very modest. And Rosie tries to get him into the limelight more, but he resists and he says, no, he's a modest guy, very quiet, very bright. Luckily enough, with a family of 12, we're Felton Road, we're very good friends with, this sounds like I'm name dropping, I don't mean to say that, but in the context, Nigel Greening knew that we'd encouraged, John had been headhunted as our winemaker, and we said, take it. It's a bigger winery, it's more exciting, encourage him to do it. So he was aware that John was going to move to another place in North Ireland. And he said, don't do anything. I'm sending my assistant winemaker up to you. And he arrived up. We didn't advertise. And I picked him up from the plane. I talked to him and I gave him the job. And he went back. He didn't really believe that I'd meant it. And I didn't hear from him. And I texted him. I said, did you get my email? And he said, is that really the job? And I said, yes. He said, do you want to see me again? No, we're good. And it was one of those Tim was very ill and I had to make a decision. So it was one of those things. I was so happy. I knew Nigel wouldn't send me anywhere. He said, if Blair left, Todd would be his winemaker. And Todd is just lovely. Everybody adores him. He's a stern workmeister, I have to say, but we're gradually softening him. Yeah, but he runs the business very well.
Well, there's nothing wrong, I think, at Neudorf to have a strict winemeister in charge of running things. There's nothing wrong with running a tight ship. And obviously, you've got plenty of flair out there in the marketing side of things anyway. So how long ago did Rosie come back to work, and how did you feel when she expressed that she would love to do it?
I don't think she ever did, to be honest. She graduated with a degree in design one day, and the next day she flew to the UK with nowhere to live and no job. So in those days, I was on Facebook and I put a Facebook message out to my friends in the UK and said, my daughter's arriving tomorrow. She knows nobody. Well, that's not quite true. She did have a couple of friends, but they didn't live in London. Has anyone got time for a cup of coffee to give us some advice? And Mel Brown, who was then working for Peter Gordon's restaurant called Providores in London as the sommelier, and she was just about to set up her own company called the New Zealand Collective. I think it was. Anyway, the New Zealand Cellar. And Rosie, she said, I haven't got money. I can't employ you. I can only give you a few hours work. And Rosie started working for her and then working as on the floor at a restaurant in London. And then she ended up, it was great success and she worked for him a long time. And Mel's fantastic. She and Rosie are like sisters. They're thick as thieves, actually. So Brexit happened and all of those extensions of the Commonwealth visas just disappeared. And so if you came from Australia, New Zealand or Canada, you couldn't stay longer than your 2 years. So she came back to New Zealand thinking that this would only be a temporary start. She didn't have a job. And I said, well, you can take my job, sort of jokingly. And I worked with her for not a very long time before I said, look, just you go. It's yours. And I'm here if you need me. And she's brilliant. She's so generationally different that I'm in awe. I'm in awe of their ability with IT. They're not put off by anything. We were quite adventurous. We were ahead of the curve on IT, Tim and I. Nowadays, oh dear. I struggle sometimes. But no, Rosie's great, really good, and she will run the company. And Todd is sort of training her to run the company. He won't be here forever, and she will be able to. But he's been the most extraordinarily careful, solicitous and encouraging general manager that she could have. They make a great pair. I think they both fill a need in each other. And she teases him relentlessly, which I can't do. Yeah.
Well, that's great to hear. And I gather it must have been around about the time, perhaps, that Todd came on board then, that Albarino became part of the puzzle. There's a little bit of the future, I suppose, there.
Yeah.
What do you think of the Albarino?
We were looking to plant something extra. Just one thing is it's all very well saying we're going to make more and more beautiful wine every year, but you've got staff that need a challenge. And we looked at Wine Society. Pierre Monsieur, he set up a whole lot of tastings for us. Then we said we really like Albarino. So we went to Spain and Portugal, and we went to about, 25 wineries, and just fell in love with it. But most of the Albarinos that we're tasting over there were blended with other more soft, because it's got quite a lot of acidity, and they were blended with more rounded grapes. So we planted our first lot here. We came back and looked at it, and getting rootstock was actually quite difficult, so it was a bit of a delay there. But we love it. It's got a briskness that we like, and it's got a salinity that we love, and it's great with fish, which is what runs Tim and Rosie's life. Rosie's a diver, and so is Tim. And so we've just sold our batch and our boat, but we're actually heading off in about an hour to the Sounds fishing for 3 days. So it's part of what we do. So we just love this grape. We seem to be able to grow it reasonably well. We're quite happy with it. It's a bulletproof grape for climate change, which Tim was very much ahead of the curve on climate change. And it's resistant to sun and wind, a little bit resistant to rain, and also to bacterial infection. It's got a lot going for it, but it's got to be kept in check as far as production goes. I've tasted a few that are almost just carrying too much acid.
Right. And Nelson's the largest open sea port in Australasia, is that right?
Yeah.
So what tends to get eaten with your Chardonnay?
Chardonnay, we've got to say it's not bad with crayfish, because it's got that richness that you get with crayfish as well. But I'm a bit of a bogan when it comes to food and wine matches. I just say if the wine's good and the food's good, they're pretty good together. But I think seafood is really good with, actually there's a lot of seafood you can have with red wine as well. So yeah, break a few rules. The temperature is probably more important than the variety sometimes.
Yeah, on a slightly different line, I know that you are a long-term supporter of the Suter Art Gallery. You've mentioned your love of books, music as well. How important is wine, do you think, not just in your life and the fulfillment it's given you, but how do we get that point across to the wider culture, do you think?
I'm an okay cook. Tim's an okay winemaker. We live in an okay area. We have people around for dinner a lot. Most winemakers do, don't they? They're usually interested in food and wine and art and books and things like that, and music. It's very rare not to find those things together. It's very rare to have a crap meal at a winemaker's house. I think you just do what you do. I've been on the Suter Gallery for far too long. In fact, I just retired last year when it became obvious that Tim was going to need more care. So I retired from a few things that I was involved in. And I thought it was pertinent when they asked me to come back. I said, no, I've still got some wisdom, but I'm not a big fan of being on a board with 85 and 89-year-olds. I think you need to be generous, bring the young people aboard. That's got nothing to do with what we're talking about, does it? What was that?
Well, no, it has. I think you were just saying about just be, I suppose, with those things of sharing and enjoying something. And I think that's absolutely right. I mean, people are talking about how do we solve this problem. You never persuade anyone by ramming it down their throat anyway. I think it's more to the point of just if enjoying wine tends to be a symptom of happiness, then just get on with it and maybe the rest will follow at the end of the day.
It's very funny, Ed, because I say that quite a lot, because I like to have friends that of all political tray. I like to have somebody that disagrees with me. But the only way I can change somebody who I consider to be more right-wing than I find acceptable is to be a better person, because I'm not ever going to change their minds because they're so rigid. It's not like it's up for a debate. They just believe, and you can't change that belief. But you can be an honourable person, and that will soften their attitude to terrible liberals like me.
You talked about, your sort of wilder, unruly youth, but also I've seen pictures, some incredibly endearing pictures of you and Tim back in the old days. Hopefully I'll be able to share some actually when we illustrate the podcast. But let's face it, it's an incredibly romantic notion of rocking up in an area, having to do everything yourself, the hardships that you kind of almost don't notice, both financially and also physically, getting all that work done yourselves, the screaming matches down on the vineyard, the trying to plant things straight when yelling at each other from the other side of it. But I guess in some ways it must have been quite hard when Tim got sick that, you don't have that sort of robust joy of youth. But at the same time, having the vineyard and all you've achieved, gazing out there or walking through the vineyard and also seeing Rosie as part of it, how does that make you feel as having a vineyard and that history that you've really put together yourself? What kind of sense of fulfillment does it give you, or comfort?
I find it, looking back on those days, I can just remember going out to dinner and then just falling asleep at the table because I was just so tired. We used to have an old Holden Kingswood with a bench seat in the front, so one of us could go to sleep on the way back to Nelson and the other one would drive, and we'd share that going through it. It was just those days of the joy of exhaustion, and there's no worry about your weight in those days. You're tired. I do remember we had so little money that I got so sick of Dalmatis. I can't look at them anymore because everybody said it's sick because it costs nothing. You go and get grapevines and fill them with rice. It's the cheapest thing you can give people to eat. But you just normalize things, and you just say, if you look at that and people think you're lying, but it was normal. If there's no money, you cope with what you've got. And I don't buy into the romantic. It is hard work making a small winery work. There's nothing romantic about it, and you can't wait. If something needs doing, it's got to be done now. And people that can't be weekend grape growers, the people that just think they can have a 5-acre vineyard, it still requires work, and there needs to be sprays when it needs to be sprayed, and it needs to be mowed, all those sorts of things, and crop thinned, etc., etc. It's an exhausting life, but it's also fantastically broad. So you're talking to interesting people from all over the world. You are learning about international finance, you're learning about crop levels, you're learning about HR. It encompasses so many skills, growing your own grapes, making your own wine and marketing it. Whereas any corporate world, that's divided up and into different sections. And here we're very anti-silo at Neudorf. In fact, we've actually got far too flat a management system here. I'd like a hierarchy myself. I'd like me right to be at the top of it. But we've all been flat management system for too long, so I'm not going to get that. And Rosie says I can't have it. So we do work on that level. Everyone's got skills, and if they've got a skill, we say you do it. Yeah.
I think it may be a line from the website that you've written, making wine is constantly scary and stimulating. It sounds like that's very much been borne out by your experience at Neudorf. But also when you look out there at the vines, there must be a big part of you that just thinks, it's so cool that we did that.
To be honest, it has never crossed my mind. And when people say that to me, I think, well, you obviously are not seeing what I'm seeing. Which is, there's always something else to do, isn't it? There's always that sort of thing. I think the challenge is still there. So I don't have that comfort of thinking, I'm old enough to be sitting in a rocking chair, but I don't want to. I just want to do more. Yeah. And Rosie's got the same feeling. She's a good taster. I'm quite impressed with that. We write the tasting notes together as a team, actually. Todd and Rosie and I sit down and write them. And Rosie and I can sometimes do the flowery stuff, and Todd will sort of rein us in and sort of talk about other things. But she's got a very good palate. I think she's got a great future. I might give her the job.
Yeah. But at the same time, you said you surrounded by books. You love books. You love music and had your wild times in the 60s. You have created something. You've created something that's given a lot of other people a lot of happiness. So even if you're looking out at the vineyard, you can see the work to be done. Creating something as you have and giving lots of people that you don't even know where they are, where they're enjoying these things, but making them happy, that must be a source of fulfillment, surely. Come on.
Actually, just recently I was talking to a friend who has done very well in the corporate world and is far more successful and far more bickies in the bank. But I said, I'm very proud that I produced something. I didn't mean in a snarky way, but it's just that I am proud, like every potter is proud, like an artist is proud, like a cheesemaker. You produce something, and so many people are just servicing something and not producing themselves. So I think producers of the world unite. That's what I'll put in my shop window. I think that we should be respected a little more.
That's it for this week's podcast. If you enjoyed it, please like, subscribe and share it everywhere. Please don't underestimate the power of these endorsements in making it possible to produce original, thoughtful work. You can also subscribe to my Substack. That's edmerison.substack.com. For now, I'd like to say thank you to Lucas James for the music, Neil Williams for the artwork, Patricio Garcia for the edit, and to my guest, Judy Finn. Till next time, live wine to the fullest. Cheers!